Started. Okay, today's daf we're learning is Eruvin Yud Aleph. Good morning to everyone and Chodesh Tov to everybody. Today's daf is sponsored by Chana and Michael Petrokowski in honor of Ozzy and Riva Essensten and their siblings Margalit, Zev, and Betzalel and their parents for the beautiful homemade card, for giving them tzedakah so they'd be able to travel safely to Israel when they made Aliyah just a few days ago. Looking forward to them to asking you should come be with them soon. Okay, so Mazal Tov on your Aliyah and B'Hatzlacha Rabba. Okay, we're going to start now from the bottom of Yud Amud Bet. Okay, we're finally, by the way, today going to finish the Mishnah and move on to the second Mishnah in Masechet Eruvin. Very exciting. Im Yeshlo, right? Sometimes we're excited. We start a new parak. When you get through the first 11 dapim of Eruvin, it's a good marker ready to say, wow, we've gone through all this already. We're in good shape. So here we go. One of the things that it said in the Mishnah was that if you have a tzurat petach and if you have this tzurat petach and your opening of your alley is wider than 10 amot, which already is a problematic opening. Normally, right, we already said yesterday, we had the whole thing, you have to make it narrower. How do you make it narrower, right? Either you put a wall in the middle going into the mavut, or you put a wall on the wall of the where the opening is, and you put a 3 amot, remember, and then it blocked off 3 and 2 and the whole issue there. But now we're going to say, let's say it's more than 10, but if you have a tzurat petach, not a lechi or a korah like we've been talking about, either a cross beam or a post, but a vertical standing post. But if you had 2 vertical standing posts and above it a beam, that resolves even a wide opening. That's what our Mishnah had said. If you recall, I don't know if you recall this, but I'll remind you, and we'll see it more today, that Rav had a different version of this Mishnah that said it doesn't help, okay? A tzurat petach doesn't help you, okay? He had a different version. But our version says, Im yesh lo tzurat petach, you don't need to make it narrower. That resolves your issue. So now we have 2 exceptions in our Mishnah. We had if it's 20 amot tall, but you have an amaltara, a very decorated, remember from the bird nests they had in the Beit HaMikdash, or those cedar wood beams. So those were very noticeable. So they resolved your issue for higher than 20. Likewise, if it's too wide, we have this tzurat petach, which resolves your issue. Well, the Gemara now wants to ask, so eshkachan tzurat petach the mahanya berochbo. So we see the tzurat petach, this has a semblance of a door opening, that resolves your width problem. And amaltara the mahanya begofho, and the decorative element resolves your height problem. If chamai, but can we flip them and say that a tzurat petach will resolve your height issue? And the amaltara can also resolve your width issue. Okay, now let's think about it. Let's think about this conceptually. Why would this work? So if you want to resolve the height issue, so you might say tzurat petach is noticeable, right? So maybe it would be more noticeable, and therefore even at a certain height, a tzurat petach could be noticed. Possibly you could say that, possibly you could say not, but maybe. The amaltara, which is noticeable, that was the whole thing. Height, you needed something noticeable. So since, right, the reason you could say tzurat petach is noticeable is, first of all, it has 2 posts on the side, so already you have more. And if you were to look up, you would see that, with the 2 posts already make it somewhat noticeable. And then having like a closure at the top, so even at a height, maybe you'd be able to notice it more. The second thing is, well, what about the amaltara? The amaltara has something noticeable. That's the whole idea. It's very noticeable. So if that's the case, why should that help your width? Your width isn't really an issue of something being noticeable or not. So it's a little bit strange why they're even suggesting that that should work. So one of the answers that they give is that the amaltara, what was the issue? The whole problem with having it wider than 10 amot is what? Once it's wider than 10 amot is what we call an entrance. Once it's wider, it's already not an entrance. We call that a pirtza, it's breached. So now they're going to say, well, think about it. Where was the amaltara in the Beit HaMikdash? It was in the entrance to the Heichal, remember, and maybe also to the Ulam, right, to the antechamber and then into the sanctuary. Because it stood in the Petach, maybe this is something that fits in an entranceway. So maybe if you have an amaltara, some decorative element in your entranceway, that already means it's an entrance, and therefore, even if it's wide, we have a different thing that determines, oh, this is an entrance anyway, even though the boundaries of it, maybe it's wider than normal. But the fact that it has a decorative element, that means it's an entranceway, right? You can think about some people in their houses, right over the entrance, they have some sort of decorative element that would kind of fit into this. So that's the logic there. Okay, so now we're going to see what's the situation. Does the amaltara resolve a width issue, and does the tzurat petach resolve the height issue? So let's look at the following source. First, we're going to deal with the height and the tzurat petach. Tashma, let's learn from the following Braita. Ditanya, it says in a Braita, Mavoy shu gavoa me'asrim ama yima'et. Okay, that's our case. The mavoy is too high. You have to lower it. In this Braita, it says it explicitly. If it's higher than 20, but you have a tzurat petach, then it's fine, no problem. But amalta baruch bomai, we still don't have an answer about the amalta. So Tashma, come and learn from here. Let's bring in another source. Tashma, I'll just every once in a while I'll drop some methodological or words. Tashma is a term that means we're going to bring in some other source. It's not an indicator. Sometimes we have words that are indicators. We're going to see a Tannaitic source. We're going to see a Moraitic source. Sometimes we have words that are indicators. We're going to have a question. We're going to have an answer. We're going to have a proof. This word is a very general word. It could mean we're bringing a proof. It could mean we're bringing a question. It could mean we're bringing an answer. It could be any sort of thing. All it means and it could mean it's Tannaitic. It could mean it's from an Amora. All it means is we're bringing something that was said. We're kind of bringing in something that we know about, and we're bringing it in here for our purposes. So for these purposes, we're going to bring it in for an answer. Tashma, Detanya, it says in a Braita, Mavoy shu gavoa me'asrim ama yima'et. V'harachav me'eser yima'et. So the first part talks about height. The second part talks about width. So both of those, right? And then it says, V'im yesh lo tzurat hapetach eino tzarich lema'et. V'im yesh lo amaltara eino tzarich lema'et. So it says both issues, and then it lists both resolutions, which makes it sound like the amaltara refers to both, really. And then it says, my lava seifa, does it not notice, the amaltara comes at the end. So that must mean it refers to case number 2, especially, which is, im yeshlo, if it's rachav me'eser yima'et, and yet the amaltara can resolve it. So it sounds like it does, but then the Gemara answers, lo, aresha. No, you could just say it's referring to the first part. In other words, each resolves one issue, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the amaltara can resolve both, and therefore we don't actually have an answer. And in fact, what's interesting here, la halacha, I don't often bring in halacha, but this is interesting. There's an interesting halachic thing going on here, which is, normally what would you say? We don't know, right? Because it's not clear, it could go either way, so we don't have an answer. Now, generally in Durabanan, Safek Durabanan, Lekula. So Mavoy, and all this is all Durabanan. So we should say an amaltara would work. But in fact, most of the poskim say it doesn't work. And then the big question becomes, why isn't it Safek Durabanan? So it's actually a big question, and I'll leave it as a question, although I'll bring one possible answer. Some people say it's actually a Doraita issue because it's a matter of what creates a mechitza. And that's a Doraita topic, even though here it's a Durabanan application of it. But the topic is, can we create a mechitza based on an amaltara, let's say. So then the issue would be a doraita issue, and that's why we'd be machmir. But really, it's a big question why we're machmir here, if really it's a safek and safek derabanan lekula. Matnela, now we get to Rav. Remember, I told you that Rav has a different version here. So Matnela Rav Yehuda lechia barav kamei de Rav. So Rav Yehuda was teaching this Mishnah in front of Chia, the son of Rav, and he was in front of Rav also. And he was teaching it to Chia barav, but Rav happened to be there. And he taught it the way it says in our Mishnah. Tzarich lema'et. Amar lei, Rav says to him, eino tzarich lema'et. You don't need to make it, right? If you have the tzurat petach, eino tzarich lema'et. So Amar lei, Rav says to him, eino tzarich lema'et. No, you have it all wrong. The version of the Mishnah should say, eino tzarich lema'et. By the way, for those on the Zoom, I forgot to put the sheet up today in the chat. But if someone could put it up, that would be great. And if you're listening, so you should open the sheet because it'll help with a lot of what's going on here, okay? Again, I'm trying in Eruvin to have a sheet on every page so that it'll help you keep organized and follow what we're up to. And as I said yesterday, even if you don't follow Hebrew exactly, the sheet is somewhat decorative in nature. I'm talking about amaltarot and decorative, but it kind of indents as we start with a statement and then we go in and we deal with that and then come back. So It just, even if you don't follow Hebrew, you could try to follow inside. It might help you anyway. Amar Rav Yosef. Midivrei Rabbeinu nilmad. He now wants to infer something. For the fact that Rav says that you can't use the Tzurat HaPetach does not resolve your width issue. Okay, he says that. So if it's more than 10, you have to make it smaller, narrower, if you want to use even a Tzurat HaPetach. So Rav Yosef is going to infer, Midivrei Rabbeinu, from Rav, we can infer the following. And then there's going to be a debate, can we really infer this or not? Chatzer, he now wants to apply this to a courtyard. Chatzer sheruba ptachim v'chalonot, eina niteret b'tzurat hapetach. Okay, so now let's say you have a chatzer, you have a courtyard that's full of windows and doorways. Okay, so what does it mean? Ruba. The majority of it is open. That's what we call, in a chatzer, we have an issue. The parutz meruba al ha'omed is a problem. If the walls of a courtyard, within a courtyard, generally it has walls, and therefore you can carry within the courtyard. But if there's less wall than standing, and there's more open space than standing space, it's going to be disqualified, this chatzer. You can't carry in it. Now, what if? Now, you'd have to assume that these windows and doorways are all within 10 tefachim off the ground. They're already open because, okay, I just want to remind you of all sorts of halachot. If you have a wall that's breached, but you have 10 tefachim off the ground of wall, then that's considered solid wall. As long as you have, 10 tefachim is pretty low. But you wouldn't think that's a wall. But halachically, that's a wall. As soon as you have 10 handbreadths off the ground of wall, that's wall. So it must be that these windows, and again, window means there's no glass in it, not like windows are. They're open. So if it's open and it's under 10, it's close to the ground within 10 tefachim, these openings, so you don't actually have a wall there. If the majority is walls, okay, that's what we call parutz meruba al ha'omed. Okay, you'll get the lingo of all these things over time. So that means it's more open than closed. So now he's going to say like this. Now, all those windows and doorways theoretically have a tzurat hapetach, right? They're in the shape of a doorway, right? They have this doorway shape. So you might think, since they have a doorway shape, right, like an opening or a window would generally have a tzurat hapetach. Okay, so now that doesn't resolve the issue. Okay, the tzurat hapetach doesn't help. Why would we assume this doesn't help? So he says, my timer, ho'il v'yot, and now he's going to make a comparison between the two. Ho'il v'yoter me'eser oser b'mavoy, u'parutz meruba al ha'omed oser b'chatzer. Okay, we're going to say what's true for a mavoy, right? What doesn't work for a mavoy? More than 10. What messes up your mavoy? More than 10 amot. What messes up a chatzer? Parutz meruba al ha'omed. So therefore, he basically says they're kind of the same, right? They're equivalent enough to make a comparison. So therefore, if according to Rav, yoter me'eser can't be resolved with the tzurat hapetach, then parutz meruba al ha'omed in a chatzer can't be resolved with the tzurat hapetach. So that's what he's going to say right now. Ma yoter me'eser ha'oser b'mavoy eino nitar b'tzurat hapetach, af parutz meruba al ha'omed oser b'chatzer eino nitar b'tzurat hapetach. Okay, since that forbids a mavoy and that forbids a chatzer, so basically, that prevents it from being good. So if a tzurat hapetach doesn't work there, according to Rav, it's not going to work there either. But now the Gemara is going to say, you can't make that comparison, Rav Yosef. Why? Because there's something about yoter me'eser which is more stringent than parutz meruba al ha'omed. Mali yoter me'eser ha'oser b'mavoy shekein lo hitarta bo etzel pasei biraot l'Rabbi Meir. Going back to something we learned yesterday, although we're going to bring up an opinion that we didn't see yesterday. Yesterday, what did we see about pasei biraot? This is where you have a well in the middle of the public domain, and you want people to be able to drink and have their animals drink on their way to go to the Beit HaMikdash on Aliyah L'Regel when everybody was going for the holidays. So they allowed these 4 little things you put in the corners, or maybe according to some there were 8, but that is a clear case of parutz meruba al ha'omed, right? You make these fake mechitzot, right, or semi-mechitzot, where they're going to function as a wall, even though they're mostly breached. Now, we saw yesterday that Rabbi Yehuda said that 13 1/3, you could have 13 1/3 amot between each of the posts that we're putting up here in the pasei biraot. That's a big space. But Rabbi Meir, who we didn't see yesterday, holds, we'll see this mission in a few dapim, he holds that it can only be 10 amot in between. More than 10 amot will be a problem. So now how does this work? So he says like this. When it comes to yoter me'eser, that's oser b'mavoy, okay, he's going to say, shekain lo itarta bo etzel pasei biraot leRabbi Meir. This concept of more than 10, when it comes to pasei biraot, Rabbi Meir didn't allow that. However, what is allowed in pasei biraot? In other words, in pasei biraot, more than 10 is not allowed. But what is allowed? Parutz merubah la'omed is allowed. So what do you see here? More than 10 is worse than having it more open than closed. Because pasei biraot can have up to 10 only. They can't have more than 10, but they can have parutz merubah la'omed. And therefore, you can't learn from one to the other because these are obviously different. Because if they were the same, then pasei biraot wouldn't be allowed, not in parutz merubah la'omed and not in more than 10. So therefore, he says, Tomar b'parutz merubah la'omed, ha'oser b'chatzil, shekein yitarta etzel pasei biraot l'divrei hakol. Everybody agrees that the pasei biraot, no matter how you do it, whether it's 8 or whether it's 4, they're clearly less wall than wall. Okay, there's much less than there is actually there. So therefore, since that's allowed, but according to Rabbi Meir, more than 10 isn't allowed, it shows that more than 10 is more strict, and therefore, if Tzurat HaPetach doesn't resolve more than 10, it still might resolve, if a Tzurat HaPetach doesn't permit more than 10, in the case of more than 10, according to Rav, but it might work in a chatzer that's parutz merubah la'omed, and therefore chatzer that's rubah, chalonot, and ptachim maybe would be okay because there's Tzurat HaPetach, as opposed to, let's say, the wall was entirely missing. So that was an attempt to knock out what Rav Yosef said. Rav Yosef tried to make a comparison. We knocked out the comparison. Now the Gemara is going to try to support Rav Yosef. Lema Meseale. Let's bring the following source as support. Tfanot halalu sherubam ptachim v'chalonot mutar ubavad shehei omed merubah parutz. If you have walls that are mostly ptachim and chalonot, that sounds exactly like our case of the chatzer. It's allowed as long as omed merubah al haparutz, as long as there's more solid than open, which seems to say that what? If it was more open than solid, it wouldn't work, which would be proving Rav Yosef. Now, first they're going to say, wait a minute, there's a bit of a problem in this case. The case just said sheruban ptachim b'chalonot. If it's majority ptachim and chalonot, then it's not omed merubah al haparutz, right? Those seem to contradict each other. It gives, right, it says the majority, and that's what we said was the chatzer case. The majority were openings, which meant that more was open than closed. This says if the majority is openings, it works as long as there's more solid wall than not solid wall. Well, that seems to contradict. So the Gemara says, Ela ema sheriba behem ptachim b'chalonot ubavad she'omed merubah al haparutz. It doesn't mean ruba, doesn't mean the majority. It means riba. You had a lot of. There were a lot of openings, but as long as they're not more, the majority is not openings, it's not 50% or 51%, then you're fine. So now this proves Rav Yosef, because Rav Yosef said, if it becomes parutz merubah la'omed, then those Tzurat HaPetach won't help you. And this Breita says exactly that. So now Rav Kahana says, no, you don't necessarily learn from here. And we're finally getting to our first picture for today, if you were missing pictures. So now he's going to say, Amar Rav Kahana, Kitanya hi bepitrei shimai. Okay, it must be that Breita was referring to where, now remember, what did we say? If there's a window, there's necessarily a Tzurat HaPetach. Now we're going to say, oh no, where he says the windows don't work is when there's no Tzurat HaPetach, and that's why, okay? But if there was a Tzurat HaPetach, it actually would resolve it, okay? So now we're going to see, how would that be? What is Pitrei Shimai? My Pitrei Shimai, Pligi Bar Rav Rechumi v'Rav Yosef. Chad amar deleitle shakfe, v'chad amar deleitle tikra. A Tzurat HaPetach has two parts to it. It has the sides, the mashkof, right, the doorposts, and it has the top part. So now we're going to see that this Tzurat HaPetach either doesn't have all these window openings that we're talking about, or door openings in the chatzer walls are ridged, right? It's not solid doorpost on the sides, or it doesn't have a roof. It's open entirely up to the sky. So that's what we're talking about. Where in that case, we're not going to actually have a Tzurat HaPetach, and that's why it doesn't help. Okay, so therefore, we tried to prove Rav Yosef from here. We couldn't prove it. So we couldn't reject him, but we rejected his opinion, his logic, and we also couldn't prove it. So it sounds like Rav Yosef kind of is weak here. But now we're back to Rav. Rav said a tzurat hapetach doesn't help you if it's wider. What picture number? Sorry, I did say it's 84 and 85. Thanks for reminding me. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan, Sarala lahadirav. Rabbi Yochanan, and we're going to derive it from something Rabbi Yochanan says, also holds like Rav, that if it's wider than 10, you cannot use a tzurat hapetach to resolve it. Well, how do we know this? Moving to picture number 86, he had 4 poles. Okay, I don't know if you can see in the video, there's 4 poles. It kind of looks like a chuppah. Okay, you have a chuppah, but instead a chuppah is covered at the top. This is 4 poles, and they strung around them. Okay, we're going to read this inside in a second. He took a vine, and he spread the vine from one pole to the other. So basically, you have 4 tzurot hapetach, right? On each of the 4 sides, you have a tzurat hapetach. You have 2 poles and something on top. Now, the topic here is not mechitza for Shabbat. The topic is mechitza for kilayim. It was in a vineyard. If you have a wall separating your vineyard from everything else, then you can plant on the other side and you don't have to worry about kilayim, about mixing crops with vines. So they said, this counts like a mechitza, okay? A tzurat hapetach functions like a mechitza. We still have to wait a little while till we get to Rabbi Yochanan and how we see that what we can learn from Rabbi Yochanan here about more than 10 amot. So far, this didn't say anything about measurements. Ubama asel lefnei chachamim. V'tiru l'inyan kilayim. So now there's a machloket Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about this. Amar Rish Lakish, kederech shitiru lo l'inyan kilayim, kach itiru lo l'inyan Shabbat. Just like they permitted this for kilayim as a machitza, this also works as a machitza l'inyan Shabbat. Rabbi Yochanan Amar l'kilayim itiru lo l'inyan Shabbat lo itiru. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. This only works for kilayim, does not work for Shabbat. Okay, so right now we see this tzurat hapetach doesn't work as a machitza for Shabbat. So now what's going to be the obvious? Well, of course the tzurat hapetach will work if it's less than 10 amot, so it must be it's wider than 10 amot. And what do you see? He holds like Rav. So that's what the Gemara is going to say. B'mayaskina. But first they're going to suggest something else. Maybe there's a different problem. Maybe it's not wider than 10. Maybe it's where, now the picture we saw, they put them at the top. But if you look at picture number 87, it could be that we're talking about where they put the vine lower down, not at the top of the pole, but somewhere in the middle of the pole. So, b'mayaskinan, ilema min hatzad, and then there's a machloket Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Does it work if you're, right, what's a tzurat hapetach? Normally we say 2 poles with a beam going on top. But what if your beam is in the middle? Okay, it's not at the top. But tzurat hapetach, generally, what does your opening of a doorway look like? There's a doorpost at the top, not in the middle, right? You wouldn't have something in the middle. It doesn't make sense. So ilem min hatzad, it can't be that it was min hatzad, and that's why they have an argument about it. Because v'hama Rav Chisda tzurat hapetach shasam min hatzad lo hatzav lo klum. Rav Chisda says this doesn't work, and it must be right now. They're assuming must be everybody holds like Rav Chisda that this wouldn't work for Shabbat. In which case, Rish Lakish can't say just like it works for kilayim, it works for Shabbat. No way. Ela al gaban. It must be it's sitting on top, that the vine was stretched on the top of the poles. Ubemai. So now again, ilema be'eser. If it's 10 or less, b'halema Rabbi Yochanan b'Shabbat lo. Why would Rabbi Yochanan say this is a problem for Shabbat? Of course, it wouldn't be a problem for Shabbat. This would work great for Shabbat. That's a tzurat hapetach, and it's less than 10. So it must be elalad v'yeter me'eser. It must be it's more than 10. In which case, Rabbi Yochanan must agree with Rav. So it's not like Rabbi Yochanan said he holds like Rav, but we assume from this case he must hold like Rav. Now the Gemara rejects and says no. La'olam be'eser u'min hatzad. You could say it is 10 and not more than 10. But what's the machloket between them? It's when the vine is in the middle. It doesn't have to be the middle. It's just not flush at the top. And maybe that's exactly their machloket. Who's to say everybody holds like Rav Chisda? Maybe Rish Lakish says we don't hold like Rav Chisda. This works. And Rabbi Yochanan says we do hold like Rav Chisda. This doesn't work. But now the Gemara says Berami de Rabbi Yochanan de Rabbi Yochanan, Berami de Rish Lakish de Rish Lakish. They actually both contradict what they say elsewhere. And we're going to see that each one disagrees with what he says in this case, but the direction is the same. The direction is Rabbi Yochanan is more machmir in Shabbat than he is in kilayim. That's going to, right, or no, I would say it like this, better. Rabbi Yochanan is more machmir than Rish Lakish. That's going to be the same in the next case, but Rabbi Rish Lakish made a distinction between Shabbat and Kilayim in the first case, and in this case, he's not going to make a distinction. And Rabbi Yochanan made a distinction, didn't make it, I'm sorry, did I just say it wrong? Rish Lakish thought it was the same for Shabbat and Kilayim in the first case, and in this case, he's going to differentiate. Rabbi Yochanan differentiated between the two. He said it works for Kilayim, doesn't work for Shabbat, and in this case, he's going to forbid in both cases. So the issue is going to be, do we differentiate between them or do we not? And that seems to be a contradiction between both these cases. So let's read. He said in the name of Rabbi Yeshua Rabbi Chanina, Pe'ah muteret linyan kilayim avalo l'Shabbat. What's pe'ah? It's very similar, but instead of having 4 and you took the vine and you spread it on all 4, we're now picture 88. You have 2 poles and you spread a vine across both, okay, in the middle of your field. So Le'inyan kilayim, this works. Avalo l'Shabbat. Here you have Rish Lakish who says this does work for kilayim, it doesn't work for Shabbat, whereas last time he said it works for both. Rabbi Yochanan Amar kim bechitzot l'Shabbat dilo, kach bechitzot l'kilayim dilo. Just like this doesn't work for Shabbat, which he said in the previous case, it also doesn't work for kilayim. Now in the previous case he says it does work for kilayim, it just doesn't work for Shabbat. So each one, so it is a braided vine. Right, it's a little bit different because it's a braided vine, although we're going to see it doesn't make such a difference, okay? Rashi says it's kli'at hazmoa hamitucha. It's a braided vine that's braided from one side to the other. So now we're going to see bishlama de Rish Lakish de Rish Lakish lo kasha. Rish Lakish we can resolve super easily. How so? Hadidei, hadirabe. I don't know if you noticed this. These are things that sometimes you have to pay attention to. When I quoted the second Rish Lakish, he quoted in the name of somebody else. It doesn't say Rish Lakish said. It says Rish Lakish said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chanina. Sorry, I said before Rabbi Yeshua by accident. It's Rabbi Yehuda. It's in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chanina, which means that maybe it's just quoting in his rabbi's name, but he himself doesn't hold that way, and then it's very simple. He said in his rabbi's name that it works, right? That it works for Kilayim, but not for Shabbat. But he himself held that it doesn't, that it works for both. Okay, that's what you would say here. Ella de Rabbi Yochanan kasha. But Rabbi Yochanan really makes no sense because he said in the first case, it works for Kilayim, it just doesn't work for Shabbat with the 4 poles. And with the 2 poles here with the braided vine, he said it doesn't work for either. So now remember, how did we resolve it last time? We said one of the answers we gave was maybe it's in the middle and that's, right? Or maybe it's at the top and then it's an issue that he doesn't hold like Rav. So now we're going to try both options. Iyamar bishlama hatam al gaban, hacha min atzad. Maybe there it's on top, and here it's in the middle, and that's why here it doesn't even work for kilayim, because it's in the middle. So maybe this case where it's braided from one to the other is in the middle. And then shapir, then you could say that's the distinction he makes. If it's at the top, right, then it works for kilayim, it doesn't work for Shabbat, and then you'd have to say it must be wider than 10, and then that goes back to the first way we understood it. But you can say it the second way, right? And then in the case with the 2, it's in the middle. But but if you want to say, like we tried to say when we rejected and said Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold this, like Rav, because we said the first case was also min hatzad, well then how could you say what's the distinction between the 2 cases? So, and here you see, so Ruth asked, is maybe there's a difference because it's braided. Here the Gemara doesn't answer that that's the difference. So what do they say? No, you could still explain it that way. We can still explain that both cases are talking about min hatzad, in which case we can't learn anything about an actual tzurah petach, and then we can't learn that he says like Rav, idiv min hatzad, hatam be'eser, hacha v'yoter me'eser. Okay, the reason is there it was 10, okay, and why was it a problem? Because it was min hatzad, right, which again shows he wasn't talking about yoter me'eser. The case with the 2 was when it was wider than 10 and min hatzad. Then it's going to be even an issue for kilayim, okay? Then it's not going to be good for kilayim. So now they say, how do we know that there's this distinction when it's min hatzad between 10 and more than 10? Right? Basically, the difference for Rabbi Yochanan is that if it's min hatzad, meaning it's not flush at the top, so for sure it doesn't work for Shabbat. The question only is, does it work for kilayim? And the answer is, if it's within 10, it works for kilayim. If it's wider than 10, it's not going to work. So how do we know there's such a distinction? Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish, lo kach haya maaseh. He said to Rish Lakish, wasn't there a case that happened? And here we're going to see a story. Halach Rabbi Yeshua Etza Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Lamod Torah. The story is going to be a little less interesting than the upcoming story. Hold off, we're getting to really good stories later. Rabbi Yeshua goes to learn Etza Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Torah. Even though Rabbi Yeshua knew a lot about Hilchot Kilayim, but despite that, he gets to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Mitza'osh Yoshev ben Ilanot. He sees him standing in between trees or sitting in between trees. Umatach zmoa mi'ilan li'ilan, and he had a vine hanging between tree to tree. Amarlo. So Rabbi Yeshua asked Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Rebbe, ikfanim kan ma wilizroa. This is your classic. He's the halachic man. He sees this vine hanging from tree to tree. He says, hey, if this were a vineyard, right? If I wanted to plant, we're in a vineyard. I wanted to plant on the other side of this, would this count as a mechitza? Amarlo, be'eser mutal, bioter me'eser asur. He says, it all depends what the distance was between the trees. If the distance was more than 10, it would be a problem. If it was less than 10, it wouldn't. So there you have it, right? Rabbi Yochanan says, look, I'm right. There's a distinction between less than 10 and more than 10 when it comes to a kilayim. Okay, but now we're going to have to say, what's the case though? We were saying there's a distinction if it's in the middle, not if it's on top, right? If it's on top, it should work. So now we're going to say, b'maya skina, what's the case? Ilema al gaban, if it's at the top, yoter me'eser asur, it can't be that more than 10 is going to be a problem. The tzurat petach, v'hatanya, hayu sham kinim hadokchanim, v'asar lehem pe'ah milamala, afilu b'yoter me'eser mutav. Says if there were these reeds and there was a thing at the top, it works even more than 10 for kilayim. So clearly that's not the issue. So we come to the conclusion that Rabbi Yochanan wasn't talking about anything that Rav was talking about, because Rav was talking about an actual tzurat petach, which he thinks doesn't work for Shabbat, right? And now we're going to see that Rabbi Yochanan, who didn't allow it linyan Shabbat, wasn't talking about that case. He was talking about when it wasn't flush at the top, but in the middle. Okay, we've come to that conclusion. Gufa. Now we're going to go back to something we saw before. Amar Rav Chisda. Okay, the first thing is we saw already, according to Rav Chisda, tzurat petach has to be flush at the top. You can't make it in the middle. By the way, this is halacha l'maaseh. It's very important. If you're making an eruv, it can't be in the middle. It has to be at the top, the tzurat petach. Amar Rav Chisda, tzurat petach shamru. Another thing he said, has to be strong enough that you could put up a door. Okay, you don't actually have to put up a door. Even a very light door, but it could have a door affixed to it. Amarish Lakish Mishum Rabbi Yana, he adds another thing. Tzurat petach tzricha hekir tzir. It needs a noticeable, I'll explain it in a minute. What is hekir tzir? Hekir is something noticeable, and a tzir is a hinge. Amar Rav Avya avkita. I know that really helps you. What is a hekir tzir? It means it's a hole, according to the picture here, it's a hole in the ground, right? You all have doors, and generally the bolt goes, if you have a good door, the bolt goes into the ground. So here you can't really see from the video, but there's a little yellow arrow there going to a hole in the ground. It has to have a place where theoretically you could put a hinge. It's number 89. Okay, picture 89. Theoretically, it has a hinge, a place where you could attach hinges, a tzir, a place for the door to, there it's really a lock, but has to have something where you could affix a door to there. Now Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avya, finds Talmidei Rav Ashi, he sees them, Amar Lu, he says to them, Amar Mar Midi b'tzurat petach, did Rav Ashi teach you anything about a tzurat petach? Amar Le, lo Amar v'lo klum. They say, no, he didn't teach us anything. That's the end. It's a little bit of a strange line. Why are they bringing us this? A lot of different explanations. I'll give one of them. One of them is that he was asking them about what Rish Lakish said about the Hekir Tzir. And he said, no, Rav Ashi never taught it. The student said, no, Rav Ashi never taught us about that, meaning you don't need a Hekir Tzir. That's what they were telling him. Tana. Tzurat petach shamru kaneh mikan, v'kaneh mikan, v'kaneh al gabehen. Okay, so now they're talking about, they bring a braita that says, this is how you make a tzurat petach. You have one post here, a post there, v'kaneh al gabehen, and one going across. But now they ask a question about this. This is another important halachic thing. Tzrichin liga, ein tzrichin liga. Do they need to be touching? Does it need to be lying? We already said it can't be minatzad. It can't be halfway through the pole or 3/4 of the way through the pole. But can it be above it where it's not attached, right? There's airspace above. So it stands right above it, but it's not attached to the posts. Could it be? So here we're going to get to an interesting story between this machloket. Rav Nachman Amar ein tzrichim liga, Rav Sheshet Amar tzrichim liga. Okay, so Rav Nachman says you don't, and Rav Sheshet says they do need to be touching. Well, here we get to our story, and I don't remember everything from the first cycle, but I do remember the story, and probably others will too, because it's one of those stories you just don't really forget. So Rav Nachman goes and builds Tzurat HaPetach in the Mavoi by the Reish Galuta's house. Who remember who Rav Nachman is? He's married to Yalta, the Reish Galuta's daughter. Famous story where she broke all the wine and the barrels of wine. And anyway, he's the basic Rav of the Reish Galuta. He's the posek for them. So there's always stories with him in the Reish Galuta, and this is one of the most famous. So he makes this Tzurat HaPetach where it's not attached, the beam is not attached to the posts. Amar le Rav Sheshet l'Shami. So Rav Sheshet has an issue with this because it doesn't follow his approach, and he doesn't like that Rav Nachman put this up. So what does he do? Right? When you're Rav Sheshet, what are your options? You could go and discuss it and have a discussion, but instead he decides to go a little underhandedly, and he sends his guy, Rav Gada, his shamash, his helper, Zil shlof shadinu. Go take it off. Right? Go get rid of this. Take off the Tzurat HaPetach and throw it away. Azal shalaf shadinu. So he goes and does this. Yeah, the Reish Galuta, they're very powerful, and they're the wealthy, and they've got all the powers. So what do? Ashkachu debei Reish Galuta. Chapshu. They find the guy who did it, Rav Gada, and they put him in jail. Right? They're like, what are you doing, breaking the Tzurat HaPetach of my mavoi? Aza Rav Sheshet. So now Rav Sheshet wants to bail the guy out. So first of all, he's destroying property, number one, and he's, but also he ruined their mavoi, their ability to carry within the mavoi. So now they assumed, because Rav Sheshet did it underhandedly, they assumed that the guy was working alone, and he was just, either he was just a crazy guy destroying property, or, he was trying to take off their mavoi, but whatever reason, he was just kind of working on his own. They put him in jail. So Azar Rav Sheshet was a big Talmid Chacham and very well respected. Kama Babi goes to the door of the jail. Amar le Gada Pukta, and nothing. Okay, he says, come out, right? And he goes and he comes out and he gets him out of jail. Okay, why did they let him out of jail? Because they realized Rav Sheshet was behind this. In other words, they had enough respect, which is interesting, right? Even though they had their own rabbi, they still had enough respect for Rav Sheshet that because Rav Sheshet said this, so they let it go. I don't know if they were so happy with him, but they weren't going to keep the guy in jail. Now the story continues. Ata eshkachei Rav Sheshet l'Rabba Bar Shmuel. Rav Sheshet sees Rabba Bar Shmuel. Amar le says to him, Tane mar midi b'tzurat HaPetach. He says, do you have anything to say? He says to Rabba Bar Shmuel about Tzurat HaPetach. Maybe he was a little bit struggling with this after this whole event happened. He says, do you have anything to say? So Amar le, yeah, I do. Tanina, I'll give you a braita, and this is something we learned in Shabbat. Kipa Rabbi Meir mechayev b'mezuzah v'chachamim potchim. You have an arched doorway where at the top, right, it's not rectangular. Normally it needs to be 4 tfachim width, 10 tfachim height to be chayav b'machitza. What if it's narrower at the top and it's not 4 tfachim wide? So we're going to now see all sorts of cases about this. They disagree about whether it's chayav b'mezuzah or not. Chachamim exempt, Rabbi Meir is mechayev. But Shavim, they all agree, she'im yesh b'ragleha asara she chayevet. That if you have 10 tfachim, when you go up into this archway, you go up 10 tfachim high, it's still 4 tfachim wide. Above that, it begins to arch. This is picture number 90. If above 10 tfachim of height, it begins to arch, then still you're chayav to put your mezuzah on the part of the arch above, even though it's not attached to the lower part. This basically shows that they don't have to be connected against what Rav Sheshet said, because we're basically saying that the upper part where it's narrower and it doesn't have 4 tefachim of width, we can view it as if it's flush with the bottom part, where it is, as long as it's 10 tefachim high, everyone agrees that you'll be chayav, 10 tefachim high, at the height of 10 tefachim, it's still 4 wide. Everyone agrees you put your mezuzah higher up, even though there it's not 4, because we view it as if it's connected. And from there you can learn to our case that would be the case. We could have stopped here, but he's gonna go into a much longer discussion, then we'll get back to Rav Sheshet's reaction to this. So now, Amar Abaye, Hakol Modim, okay, next picture number 91. Everyone agrees that im gvoha asara ve'im b'ragla shlosha. if it has 4 tefachim of width, but the 4 tefachim of width doesn't even extend for the first 3 tefachim off the ground, everyone agrees it's not chayav and mezuzah. Because remember, 3 tefachim to the ground is as if it's at the ground. So you don't even have 4 tefachim of width at 3 tefachim of height for sure not. Yinami, or yesh baragla shlosha ve'en gvora asara. If it doesn't get to a height of 10 at the highermost point in the middle there, also below klum, you definitely don't need anything. Keep pligi. What's the machloket? Yesh baragla shlosha. If you have 3 tefachim of height and already 4 tefachim of width, and then it's gvora asara, but when you get to the top, it's ein rechava arba'a. It's already narrower and not 4 tefachim wide. That's when there's a machloket. In the case where the yesh bo lachok lashlima la'arba. Okay, you can look at the pictures in between. I'm now skipping to picture number 94. Picture number 94 is where ein bo lachuk kedei lashlima. Meaning if you have just an arch and there's nothing above, it's not filled in, then you can't theoretically open this up to a 4x4, to 4 width at the top, because there's nowhere to open it. You'll basically just have no arch there and nothing there. So that's not a case where they have a machloket. But if it's a solid wall, okay, like take picture number 93, it's a solid wall and you can theoretically widen it, theoretically, just by being able to theoretically widen it to 4 tefachim at a height of 10, as long as there's 3 tefachim at the bottom that are 4 tefachim wide, 3 tefachim of height, then there's a machloket. And then Rabbi Meir sabar chokekin lahashlim, v'Rabanan sabar ein chokekin lahashlim. Rabbi Meir says we view this as if you opened it, and therefore you be chayav mezuzah. Chachamim say no. But in any case, the important part was what we said earlier. So where it basically proved that Rav Sheshet is wrong about the way he thought. So what's Rav Sheshet's interesting reaction? Right, you can imagine a lot of reactions. You can imagine he goes to the Rav Reish Galut and he apologizes. So I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Or to Rav Nachman. Listen, do me a favor. Don't go tell this to the Reish Galuta, because I'm going to get in big trouble and it will be a huge embarrassment for me. So let's just keep this in between you and me, okay? We're not going to go farther with this. Interesting reaction. Okay, we'll quickly do the Mishnah and maybe a little bit farther. We'll try to get through a little bit more. Hechsher mavoi. Finally, we're up to Mishnah number 2. How do you fix a mavoi? Beit Shammai omrim lechi v'kora. You need a post and a crossbeam. Beit Hillel omrim o lechi o kora. That's what we've been saying all along. Beit Hillel is one or the other. Rabbi Eliezer omer lechayim. You need 2 lechis. Mishum Rabbi Yishmael amar tamid achad lefnei Rabbi Akiva. Someone in the name of Rabbi Yishmael said to Rabbi Akiva, lo nechleku Beit Shammai u'Beit Hillel amavoi shu pachot me'arba amot shu nitar o belechi o bekora. Even Beit Shammai agrees that if it's only 4 amot wide, until now we keep talking about 10 amot, he comes down and says, if it's less than 4 amot wide, the entrance, then even Beit Shammai agrees a lechi or a korah is enough. The machloket is between 4 and 10 amot. Then they have a machloket, Beit Shammai omrim lechi v'korah, Beit Hillel omrim o lechi o korah. That's Rabbi Yishmael's interpretation. Rabbi Akiva, often we have this where there's a machloket about the machloket. What do Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree about? Rabbi Akiva says, al zev al zeh nechleku. They argue actually about both cases. Kiman. Now they say this mission is delo kechananya v'lo ketanakama. Remember Chananya and Tanakama? If it's a mavoi mefulash open on both sides, you need a lechi and a korah, or a lechi or a korah, and a tzurat petach on the other side, or maybe a door on the other side. This clearly doesn't show either of those. So Amar Yehuda Hachi Kamar Hechsher mavoi satun ketzad. This is talking about a mavoi with 3 walls. Beit Shammai omrim lechi v'korah, Beit Hillel omrim o lechi o korah. So now they say Beit Shammai omrim lechi v'korah lememer de kasaver Beit Shammai arba mechitzot oraita. Is do they need a lechi and a korah because they think you need an actual mechitza, and only by having both going in both directions is that considered a mechitza? And the midoraita, the mechitza is only if you have actually 4 walls. So they say lo. Lizrok mishaloshu d'machayev. Again, Rishud Yachid has 2 elements. Number 1, if we call this a Rishud Yachid, then if you pass from Rishud Rabim, you're going to be obligated midoraita. But it also has a leniency, which is we can now carry in here. So when it comes to throwing in and saying this is actually called a Rishud Yachid, Shalosh is enough mechitza to have already midoraita to be, you're going to be obligated. But litaltel, but to allow carrying, adi ika arba, you're going to need 4. Beit Hillel omrim o lechi o korah. So lema kasaver Beit Hillel shalosh mechitzot oraita. Is he saying 3 walls is what we call the oraita, and that less would not be a wall to oraita? So they say lo. Lizrok shtayim, he goes down 1 step. Already lizrok shtayim hu d'mechayev hu d'mechayev. if you throw into a space that has only 2 walls, already that's considered a Reshut Yachid, you're going to be obligated. If you throw from Reshut Rabin to Reshut Yachid, he thinks already that you're obligated. But L'taltel Adi Kashalosh. But to allow carrying, again, we keep making this distinction between we're going to be Machmir and call it Reshut Yachid even at less, but we're going to be more Mekel, lenient when it comes to, and we're going to be more stringent when it comes to the leniency of carrying. We're going to have to be more stringent and say you need extra. Okay, that's it for right now. We'll pick up with Rabbi Lezer tomorrow. Chodesh Tov to everybody.